Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Ken Hirsch.
Today's event, Elections, A More Perfect Union, is an incredible program and a very important topic. At the Bush Center, we have the honor of working on the priorities of President and Mrs. Bush that they established while they were in the White House and taking on new initiatives inspired by their values of freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. Our mission here is simple. Through policy solutions and public engagement, we work to ensure opportunity for all, to strengthen democracy, and to advance free societies. We combined ideas and action to improve the lives of people at home and around the world. A presidential center is the perfect place to talk about strengthening our democracy, and we're pleased to be joined by representatives of many of the other presidential foundations from around the country. I'd like to also thank our Bush Center supporters, especially those who are with us today, and John Now for his support of our work in strengthening our democracy in particular. We're grateful for his partnership and for being a champion of this important work. And to our partners at the Partnership for American Democracy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Karsh Institute for Democracy at the University of Virginia. We're glad we could all work together to organize this important day. At the Bush Institute, we've worked for many years to promote freedom and democracy around the world. But it's become clear in recent years that more and more Americans are losing faith in our democracy here at home. 5 years ago, we undertook a nationwide polling project in partnership with Freedom House and the Penn Biden Center to understand more about Americans' beliefs concerning democracy. At that time, it showed that nearly 7 in 10 Americans thought our democracy was getting weaker, and we haven't seen much improvement since then. Given the eroding trust in our institutions, it's important for each of us to play a role in restoring that trust. At the Bush Center, we're committed to reversing the slide. We have now reached the moment to call to support our institutions. We should not storm them, nor attempt to tear them down. Our institutions have survived for nearly 250 years, despite the ebb and flow of public opinion. Our founders designed a living framework capable of changing, adjusting, and healing. It's also time to remind ourselves that decency and civility are everyone's responsibility. The 18th century British statesman Edmund Burke taught us, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. President Bush made that challenge personal in his first inaugural address, when he said, "We must live up to the calling we share. Civility is not a tactic or a sentiment. It is the determined choice of trust over cynicism, of community over chaos." A core component of a strong democracy is free, fair, and secure elections. As a rule, this should be easy. It should be easy to vote and hard to cheat. One of the best ways to increase trust in our elections is to participate. And it's a sad state of affairs when the Johnny Depp trial is more popular than the issues in our election. That means more than just voting. It means voting in the primaries, the runoffs, and the general election. But participation is even more than that at a personal level. For example, during our 2020 election cycle, we at the Bush Center encouraged our staff to train to be poll workers, or to provide childcare so others could go to the polls, or to help new Americans decipher the voting process, or find other ways to encourage participation. We practice civil discourse and problem solving, and we hope today's discussions and announcements both provide clarity on many of the misconceptions about our elections and also spur action to build trust in our elections here at home. This work is critical. We cannot take our freedoms for granted. Ronald Reagan made that point clear when he said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same." This is not only important for our survival as a free people, but it is critical for the world because what happens here informs matters elsewhere. With our dysfunction and division here at home, we risk losing the moral high ground that younger democracies look to for courage and hope that they are on the right track. We should be examples for the world's democracies. We must get our act together so we can project that virtue and inspire them. After 9/11, President Bush explained, "We are in a fight for our principles, so it is important that we live by them." That's our charge here at the Bush Center. We are blessed to live in this great country, and it is our collective responsibility to continue to strive to make it a more perfect union. Thank you. And now I would like to turn it over to a message from John Bridgeland, the Executive Chair of the Partnership for American Democracy, one of our partners in today's events and a longtime friend of the Bush Center, who unfortunately took ill and could not be here today, but he's here on the big screen. John.
Thanks so much, Ken, to you, President Bush, Secretary Rice, Holly Kuzmich, and the great team at the Bush Presidential Center for co-hosting this action-forcing event on our elections at such a critical time in our country. And thanks to the other co-hosts, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and its Inspiring Our Common Purpose Roadmap, led by David Oxtoby and Stephen Heinz, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and its wonderful CEO, Pat Harrison, with whom we've had the privilege of working on the High School Dropout Challenge over the last 20 years with good results, and the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia, led by the great Melody Barnes, which includes our dear friend, Secretary Margaret Spellings, on its advisory. I want to give special thanks to our Partnership for American Democracy team, Diana, Ashley, Alan, Jesse, Molly, and Nancy, and our National Leadership Council members and partners who were with us today. I wanted so much to be with you today, infectious for democratic renewal, and instead I'm infectious with COVID. So my civic act is not to infect you. When we used to brief President Bush in the Oval Office, he always had a series of 4 questions for us. First, what's the goal? Then what's the evidence-based plan of action to meet it? Who is going to implement the plan with quality? And how will we be accountable for results over time? So as we approach the 250th anniversary of our country's independence in 2026, we wanted to organize an effort that we are launching today with these partners, 9 presidential centers, and more than 100 organizations across the United States called More Perfect, that would meaningfully advance 5 sustainable democracy goals. I want to thank the many representatives of the presidential centers who are with us today and look forward to our work together. Effective democracy requires an understanding of its values, its history, and its systems. So we begin the effort with a focus on increasing civic learning, school by school, state by state. One strategy should be to deploy the great historian Jon Meacham all across America. Goal 2 expands opportunities for national service and volunteering, so young Americans have a rite of passage as they come of age and learn to solve problems with people of different politics, faiths, races, and backgrounds. As General McChrystal reminds us, you don't have to wear a military uniform to serve your country. And William F. Buckley, that Republican citizenship beckons everyone to be a knight. Our third goal recognizes that our crisis of polarization can yield only to efforts at civic healing, and our social crisis of fragmentation can be confronted only by efforts to reknit social ties. So here come the bridge builders. Our fourth goal focuses on effective governance, including fair and trusted elections, the urgent focus of today's event. And our final goal will work to increase access to reliable and trusted news and information so that we have some sense of shared truth. As we teach a generation coding, we must also teach them the decoding of news and information. For each of these goals, we will have a series of cascading events with our partners, particularly the presidential centers, that align efforts, generate resources, and prompt further action on these 5 goals. Nothing seems more urgent than the bedrock of free and fair elections, fostering a better understanding of how they work, the checks and balances to avoid error and fraud, and how Americans can engage as voters, poll workers, and volunteers. So we begin today our inquiry here as we move into the midterms in 2022 and the presidential election in 2024. This isn't just a day to talk, but to prompt action. And throughout our program, we will be making a series of announcements to move the agenda, together with more than $30 million in new investments in democratic renewal. I'll close by thanking our collaborating partners, the leaders, speakers, and panelists today, the co-chairs of our 5 pillars of action, and dozens of institutions that are crossing politics and other divides to renew and strengthen American democracy. Consider them all guardians of democracy. It is now my great pleasure to introduce a true American treasure, an author, presidential historian, co-chair of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy, and professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Please warmly welcome Jon Meacham.
Thank you. Thank you. So speaking as a national treasure, I was standing there and I was thinking, yeah, I kind of am. And my mind went back, it's been about 12 years ago now. I was on the Washington Mall at the National Book Festival that Mrs. Bush organized. And I was on my way at that point to give my talk about Andrew Jackson. And a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually. And she said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, you know, existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with, you know." I live in Tennessee, so I have to leave the state to use existential as an adverb. And she said, your books have meant so much to me. Will you wait right here? I'm gonna go buy your new book and have you sign it. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I stood there thinking, this is the way the world is supposed to be, right? Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest. No. So, whenever I think I'm a national treasure, I remind myself that somewhere in America there's a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. And this is the only audience in America that will appreciate the second part of that story. I was writing the book about President Bush Sr. at that time. It was supposed to be posthumous, but he wouldn't die. Yeah, not gonna do it. And I was on my way to see the Bushes, and for some reason it was just the 3 of us at lunch that day in Maine. And as you all know, Bushland was like a WASP Epcot. You know, Gorbachev would be on the putting green, the Oak Ridge Boys would be there, you know, but it was just us. And I told the story about being mistaken for John Grisham, and I will confess to you, it was an entirely transparent attempt to get either the former president or the former first lady to say, "Oh, you're so much more important than John Grisham," right? So I cast out the bait, and Barbara Bush looks across the table in that inimitable way of hers and says, "Well, how do you think poor John Grisham would feel? You know, he's a very handsome man." So it was a bad weekend. On to democracy. Washington was riven with rumors as the new year began. Insurrection was a consuming fear. A former governor of Virginia was said to be raising a 25,000-man army to prevent the newly elected president from taking office. Others reported plots to poison the horses of the military, destroy the Capitol building, hang members of the victorious party. Yet another rumor had protesters arriving with concealed arms, bribing federal troops, and seizing government buildings. Treason, a Nashville correspondent warned officials in Washington, is all around you. It was 1860-61. Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, stepped into the breach. Anyone, he announced, who attempted by force or parliamentary disorder to obstruct or interfere with the lawful count of the Electoral College would be lashed to the muzzle of a 12-pounder and fired out a window of the Capitol. So much came down to a single man and a single moment, the Vice President of the United States, John Breckinridge, who was to certify the election for Abraham Lincoln. Breckinridge was the object of all eyes on Wednesday, February 13th, 1861. It was the January 6th, 2021 of the era. 100 plainclothes police from New York and Philadelphia were stationed in the Capitol, prepared for any emergency. Breckinridge did his duty with, as a contemporary recalled, Roman fidelity, and the nation was saved. As a Kentuckian, Breckinridge, a future Confederate general and member of Jefferson Davis's cabinet, opposed secession at that juncture, and as Vice President of the United States, he honored his oath and acted according to constitutional principles. Democratic elections can only long endure in that kind of moral covenant. a covenant in which we accept commonly agreed upon rules, a covenant in which we see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors, not as combatants, but as fellow citizens. A covenant in which the Constitution is seen as protecting your rights and my rights. It is striking and dispiriting to even have to note this. But we do ourselves no favors by pretending that we're in anything other than an hour of destructive distrust, an hour in which the will to power at any cost is seeking to displace the will of the people. This is not hyperbole, and it is surely not partisan. I am neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I have voted for presidential candidates of both parties. And I speak to you now as a historian of the American past and as a citizen of the Republic that only 16 months ago came as close as we have since Fort Sumter to losing the constitutional ethos that has shaped our lives for almost 250 years. History, though, does give us some grounds for hope. Again and again in the American story, there have been moments when the experiment could have come to an end, the victim of a single man or a single party, and their thirst for dominance at the expense of democracy. Think of the stakes. Democracy depends on elections, and democracy is the articulation, maintenance, and defense of the Jeffersonian rights of innate God-given equality. Equality before the law over and against demagogues who seek control over the common good. And there is no more vivid contest in which to see that which vision will prevail, that of brute power or that of the democratic rights of all, than in elections. In 1864, 4 years after the drama we just discussed, amid the Civil War, it was a credit to the constitutional system that the election went forward at all, and that President Lincoln was openly committed to accepting an outcome adverse to his own interests. From age to age, what I'd suggest we think of as constitutional character has validated American elections. Constitutional character. In 1800, John Adams accepted a narrow defeat at the hands of Thomas Jefferson, peacefully ceding ultimate power in the new republic. Adams did so because he believed in the Constitution even more than his not inconsiderable personal ambition. A quarter of a century later, Andrew Jackson, who was hardly the most placid of public figures, thundered against what he called a corrupt bargain, arguably the first hashtag in American history, that had cost him the presidency in the House despite his winning the popular vote. Yet that thundering took place from Nashville, not at the head of an army on the banks of the Potomac. Jackson did what statesmen of a constitutional character should do. He accepted the result, however much he hated it, and ran again according to the rules, and he won. At either end of the 1960s, Richard Nixon declined to pursue the closest of results against John F. Kennedy, and then 8 years later, Hubert Humphrey accepted an equally narrow margin of defeat. And in 2000, both Al Gore and George W. Bush demonstrated great constitutional character amid crisis and uncertainty. A winter Wednesday, December 13th, 2000, is a landmark date. In Washington, Vice President Gore conceded the election, saying, "I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Yet it came, and now it has ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy." In Austin, President-elect Bush drew on 1800, on Adams and Jefferson, to call the nation to unity, quoting Jefferson, who said, "The steady character of our countrymen is a rock to which we may safely moor, unequivocal in principle, reasonable in manner." President-elect Bush added, 200 years have only strengthened the steady character of America, and so tonight I call upon that character, respect for each other, respect for our differences, generosity of spirit, and a willingness to work hard and work together to solve any problem. Constitutional character. No matter how our laws are framed, American elections depend upon the character of the powerful and of the people, the character of a Jefferson or an Adams or a Gore or a Bush. That's because elections are not clinical, but human enterprises. And they are the oxygen of democracy, for without them, democracy dies. Covenants only hold when all parties hold up their side, win or lose, and especially when you lose. Our current crisis of character, of distrust and disinformation is far from over. May we draw strength from the storms of the past as we confront the present. In 1864, the Secretary of State, one of the more frustrated would-be presidents in American history, William Seward, told his townspeople in Auburn, New York, "I, like you, am called by my vote to determine into whose hands the precious trust shall now be confided. It is a constitutional trial, and the nation must go through it deliberately and bravely." Now we face our own hour of constitutional trial, of constitutional character. And may we meet that trial with deliberation and with bravery. We owe generations past and surely owe generations to come nothing less. Now the smart people will come out. Please welcome the first panel. Our leader.
All right. Hello and welcome to our first official panel of the day, which is appropriately titled, Our Elections Today. I'm your moderator. I'm Leah Wright-Rigueur. I'm a professor of history at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Now, I have the pleasure of moderating what's going to be, I'm sure, a brilliant discussion today with three distinguished speakers and scholars. And I'm going to briefly introduce them now, starting with Jon Meacham, who you all just met. So Jon is a historian. He is
National treasure.
National
Work that
treasure.
in.
I'll work that in somehow. Money in the bank. All right. So he is co-chair of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity in American Democracy. He's a professor of political science and the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. Next, we have Yuval Levin, the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And then last but not least, we have Rachel Kleinfeld, a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now, a few brief words before we jump into our discussion. The goal of this panel, as you may have heard earlier, is to really affirm the role of inclusive and credible election in today's democratic society. Our panelists will draw, of course, on their long and varied backgrounds and various expertises to examine and affirm the democratic process and the significance of elections in our society today. Yet, we're not just here to do that, or as actually Rachel just mentioned in one of our pre-conversations, to suggest that elections are simply important. We all know that. We know that there's no shortage of the sentiment among the general American public that elections are important. But what we're here to do today is affirm the legitimacy of elections, and that yes, our election processes do work when we invest in them, and they have worked and they continue to work. In November and December of 2020, for example, every major election agency in the country, whether it be a Republican, Democratic, nonpartisan, right, across the political spectrum, public, private, they all highlighted that the 2020 presidential election was the most secure election in American history, while also recording record turnout among voters. Elections are certainly complicated, and they provoke the most dramatic of emotions among constituents and citizens. But we also know that the ability to accept the electoral process as credible, as legitimate, even when the results aren't in our favor, is a vital part of the American democratic experiment. It is the central part of the American democratic experiment. And so that's a little bit of what we will be talking about today. So without further ado, I'd like to start our panelists off with a foundation-setting question. And I'm going to start first with Jon, but I would encourage Yuval and Rachel to jump in because I know you guys have interesting and important things to say on this. But I want you to expand a bit, Jon, on the comments that you made in your opening remarks. I want you to talk a little bit about our nation's track record when it comes to elections. Right? Have they improved over time, right? Could they be improved over time?
Sure, everything can be improved, and people who win always think it's working quite well. And you know, Bob Dole used to say he doesn't believe polls unless he's ahead, and so that tends to be a perennial characteristic. You know, we've gone from showing up at a courthouse and standing up for your candidate, you know, no secret ballot, to, I would say, a remarkably secure capacity to count votes incredibly quickly. Every election night, I'm puzzled. I can't balance a checkbook, so numbers are not a strong suit. But I'm amazed at how quickly we actually get results. And so there's a technological level of efficiency that seems quite remarkable to me as a humanities person. I'm just in awe of that. Here's the, and I don't want to mention Voldemort, but there's a reason we're sitting here. A reason we're sitting here. And so I decline to accept the premise of a self-interested assertion and declare that there's some kind of systemic failure. I just don't think that's true. And I think, 70, you just alluded to it, 70 judges, the Supreme Court of the United States with its silence on the matter, what did they find? That there were something like 60 cases of voter fraud in the 2020 election, and most of them were on the White House staff. So I just don't, you know, I mean, apparently Mark Meadows votes in 3 or 4 states. So I just don't accept the premise that our elections are broken. Our trust is broken, and the manifestation of that and the test of that trust is in believing in the results. And that's why I think this is more about character than it is about technology, personally.
Rachel, Yuval?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, part of this, so first of all, I defer to Jon on history. So I'm about to mention history. It's very shaky ground. But you know, part of this gets to how you conceive of a perfect election. I've done election monitoring in Bangladesh and Pakistan, all over the world. And it's hard to monitor elections because elections are huge human endeavors, and humans are not perfect. God is perfect. The rest of us are doing our best. And you know, at our founding, you had Hamilton and Madison arguing about this, and you had Madison saying elections have to be perfect, and if they're not perfect, redo, redo, redo. And Hamilton said they have to be good enough, but we're human. We're going to get them more perfect, and what you need to do is have a system that you trust and that can get more perfect over time, and that is not so bad that it's affecting the outcome. But you're not going to have an absolutely perfect election in 13 colonies at that point, and the 3rd biggest country in the world at this point. And that difference kept playing out through our history. We've had a lot of violent elections. We've had governors calling out their militias in at least 5 states in the 1900s. We'd had people coming to blows in Connecticut, New Jersey, all sorts of places over elections because we weren't perfect. But by believing in a system, and by saying we're getting more perfect, we believe that it's good enough to make these decisions, we've actually created a nation that has lasted for 200 years. Democracies don't last forever unless you keep investing in that greater effort to make them more perfect.
I would only add to this that I think it's it's relatively easy to show on the sort of core questions of what makes an election worthwhile and legitimate that our elections have gotten much better over time. If by that we mean more people can vote and there's less fraud, there's just simply no question that American elections today, the United States to begin with, look, the American Constitution was ratified by what was at the time the most democratic election in human history, but it still allowed only a very small portion of our society to vote. Over time, more and more Americans were allowed to vote, first through lines of race, then through lines of sex, and over time, from de facto to de jure, it became possible for anyone who wanted to vote, who was an American citizen and an adult, to vote. And at this point, that is essentially the case. It is a huge advance over where our country has been for most of its history. And there is far less fraud in our elections than there would have been in any point in the 19th century, at almost any point in the 20th century. It is much easier to vote, and there is far less fraud in American elections now. And so in that straightforward sense, there's no question that we have improved. Where we have lost ground, as John says, is on the question of trust. And I do think there are some historical parallels to think about. John mentioned a number of the most important ones. Maybe I would only add the 1876 election, which was a very close-run thing. In 1876, there was, in some ways, it's the best analogy to 2020. There was dispute about counting in a variety of states. There were multiple electoral vote ballots from several states, some large states, and there was no president decided within a week of the inauguration. They could not arrive at a decision. Ultimately, it worked out. Ultimately, the loser accepted the loss. Ultimately, the country accepted it, but ultimately felt a lot like this. I mean, the process of getting there was very messy and very dangerous, and it resulted in some legal frameworks that are still with us to allow us to deal with these kinds of problems. What's necessary, what's essential is trust. I would only say trust is what was missing in 2020. The system itself worked extremely well under very difficult circumstances in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic when nobody knew quite how to work around the challenges people had of getting to the vote. The election worked in every state. What happened until January 6th was every state certified its electoral votes in accordance with how its people voted. All the states sent Congress exactly what they should have sent. And then there was a breakdown in Congress. And that breakdown was not about the election system. That breakdown was about the loss of trust in our political system more broadly. Clearly a problem that has to be dealt with, but it has to be dealt with from a point of view that understands that our elections work well. The problem we have is a collapse of trust in our larger political system, and that's where we have to work.
Okay, so all three of you have mentioned trust and the breakdown of trust and the loss of trust. So I want to turn our attention to that. And I want to think about the dark side of things. I want to think about what happens when that trust erodes, when it disappears. You know, what does democracy look like at that point once trust in our elections is gone, right? And so we heard that amazing statistic earlier that I think 7 out of 10, people feel that they can't trust the elections or the election results. If we look at the numbers in terms of confidence in Congress and the process, those numbers are astronomically bad. But what does it mean beyond the fact that people don't trust the institutions? What does it mean for other industries? What does it mean for other institutions? What does it mean for the question of democracy more broadly?
I'll answer your dark side question very quickly and more darkly. It's over. It would be over. What happened? What does it look like when you don't have trust in elections? You have people sack the Capitol. We don't have to imagine what that is. There's video of it. We watched it. It's Hobbes. We all want to live in John Locke's world, where the state of nature is that we all recognize each other's equality. In fact, we live in, I believe, Thomas Hobbes' world, which is the state of nature is one in which life is nasty, brutal, brutish, and short. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic. Democracy does not survive without that trust.
So I've worked in a lot of countries where there is not much trust, and it is not pretty. It gets to your point about Hobbes versus Locke.
Which is a sentence you want to say on Wednesday afternoon as much as you can.
None of us want to be here discussing our own country this way. I have a whole career discussing other countries this way. When trust is like society's immune system, it lets you fight off problems. It lets you deal with invaders, intrusions. If you lose trust, you can't do those things. It also makes you richer. Societies that have more trust have higher GDP. You can have more business deals across different groups. When societies lose trust, people start doing business only with people like them. And it makes everybody poorer. It makes it harder to move things around the country. It makes it harder to move goods. So it's not just that it results in war, which it does, that it results in higher murder rates, which it does throughout our history from our founding, but it also results in everybody being impoverished in very real ways. And so building back trust, it doesn't mean to be Pollyannish. Some level of distrust is always a good thing in a government, but we need to have some faith in our fellow citizens. And with that faith in our fellow citizens, some faith in our system. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You can't run a country that way, and you resolve back to a state of nature.
Yuval?
I would certainly second that. I think trust is the magic potion. Trust is the secret sauce. We can persuade ourselves, as we as political scientists do, that it's all about the system and the rules and the mechanisms. But none of those things are of any value if people fundamentally do not trust each other. And at that point, none of it is able to work. I think this also brings us back to the basic question of elections, because in a certain sense, elections are the linchpin of legitimacy. They're the reason why everything else, all those rules, all those structures, have the confidence of the public. A system like ours that tries to balance empowering majorities with protecting minorities, as our Constitution tries to do, is a combination of majoritarianism and counter-majoritarianism, things which are in tension with each other. We try to do them at the same time. And the reason we can is that ultimately everything falls back on elected officials. Ultimately, there's a sense that this all has to answer to us. And if we don't have that sense, if the election result is not what determines everything else, but rather is, like everything else, determined by the fight between the parties, if it's just another one of the contested areas that we're fighting to control and command, then everything else becomes impossible. The arena where we resolve differences, the space where we settle our disputes peacefully, becomes a place that's closed down, that's just another battlefield. And without that core sense of trust, that belief that everybody comes into this ready to win or lose, we're following the rules and we'll see what the outcome is, without that, nothing else is going to work.
So, Yuval, let me ask a follow-up question on that. So one of the things that we've seen historically, but also in, I think, larger maybe geopolitical context, is that trust seems to go hand in hand with winning. Right? So people are more trusting if they feel like their side has won. But as you've pointed out, as we've pointed out here today on the stage, accepting loss is also an integral part of this. But it seems like it's at odds, perhaps, with the idea of building trust. Yeah. So I'm wondering, perhaps, if you can talk about this idea of being the ability to accept loss, the ability to say, my side hasn't won in this election, and how we work that into an understanding of trust.
I think we have a number of key mechanisms for allowing people to accept loss. One is those counter-majoritarian institutions that protect the rights of minorities, that say to lose is not to lose everything. It's not to lose your basic rights. It's not to lose your community. It's not to lose your control over your life. It's to lose the commanding heights of governance for a time. And second is that for a time, that no loss is permanent, no win is permanent, no faction is permanent. We're not just a country divided in two, and the question is which side domineers the other. We find ourselves as individuals in all manner of different kinds of parties and factions. Sometimes we're part of a winning coalition, sometimes we're part of a losing coalition, and when we lose, we have the sense that next time we could win. If that's not the case, if it seems to us that the factions are permanent and that everything depends on winning or losing, then the stakes become so high that you can't accept the contest. You can't say this is up to the voters now when what's up to the voters is everything. And so some constraint on politics, along with a sense that none of our coalitions are permanent, that these are different fights over different things, and sometimes I'm in the majority and sometimes I'm in the minority. I think all of that is what we stand to lose through the kind of polarization that we're witnessing now. We come to a point where it seems like everything is a fight to the death, and it's all the same fight. All the different arguments we have are all different ways of asking the question, are you on this team or are you on that team? That's where democracy loses its way, and I think we've got to recover ways of differentiating, of allowing questions to be settled at different levels of government, in different institutions of society, at different times in different ways, so that we don't get to a place where everything depends on the election result, because at that point, we're asking too much of elections.
So, Rachel, I want to turn to you for a second. A couple of years ago, there was a really fantastic book that came out called, How Democracies Die, right? We've all heard it, sure. And I think a lot of Americans were really kind of moved by the idea, or those Americans that read it, they were moved by the idea that democracy can die in this country. Now, you have a comparative perspective where you've looked at countries where democracy has not existed, but I think also where democracy has collapsed. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about that, perhaps specific instances. I know you've mentioned Bangladesh, you've mentioned Hungary. Is there a comparative element, particularly for a place like the United States, where there's this really, I think, pervading assumption that democracy just exists? It's not something that, as we've talked about, has to be worked on. It's not something that can be undone, and we're at the cusp of seeing that undone.
It's a great question. So I think a lot of Americans feel we're in the world's oldest democracy. It's been around a couple hundred years. It'll live another couple hundred years. But no system lives forever. And Rome fell. The Greek city-states fell. We are the oldest democracy that's ever existed. And some people take a lot of comfort in that. And they think, oh, it'll never break down. They're kind of like, I've got 2 young children, kind of like my young children who think, oh, mom and dad will always be there. We can be as mean to them as we want to be. They will always be there for us. My kids are right, but we are wrong about our democracy that way. I think the better way to see American democracy actually is like an old house with funky plumbing. When we go around the world, I'll get back to that. When we go around the world, and America does, we support democracies all over the world. We don't build any democracy that looks like ours. We don't build what's called presidential majoritarian systems that have first past the post elections. To normal people, what that means is when you have a system with a president and a legislature that can be of very different parties and that can fight, you have a legitimacy issue. And in democracy studies, we look at that and we say almost all countries like that have failed. There's only been about 5 that lasted more than 50 years. 3 of those, have now failed. So it's us and Costa Rica that have kept their systems more than 50 years. And we don't create first past the post elections generally, because if you can get 50% plus 1, there's a lot of incentive for voter suppression, for violence, and we see those systems creating violence all over the world. Wow. And so when we go around the world, we build different systems. We didn't know that. We were the first democracy in a long time when our founding fathers built ours, and they did a great job. But the plumbing's a little funky. And so it's better to think of our democracy as like an old house where you're careful what you flush. You just have to be a little more aware of the fact that it can fall apart, and you don't want to pay the plumbing bills, and you might not be able to fix it. And take a little care of this democracy, which is beautiful and able, and it's a strong system. As Yuval has said, we've got these majoritarian systems, these counter-majoritarian. It works like a beautiful clock when it works, but it's not always going to be there if we're not careful with it.
May I ask you a question? Is there any other, I'm embarrassed I don't know the answer to this. We're actually not a first past the post system.
Well, we're a
50
plus 1.
Of the second tier of the process. So, I mean, one of the things you see in a crisis of trust is, wait a second, this isn't even a majority deciding this because of the Electoral College. Is there anything, I'm a little rusty on my Costa Rica politics.
America's a real unusual system. Argentina tried to copy our system. Venezuela tried to copy our system. Neither of these, Argentina is a democracy, but it's had some trouble. It had a big populist wave. Venezuela is not a democracy anymore. So in Latin America, 100 years ago, we did build a number of systems that look like ours, and they haven't done wonderfully.
So, Jon, you actually brought up something that I wanted to jump into, but since you brought it up, I'm going to ask you first. Let's talk about the Electoral College, right? That's the thing that I think people tend to hone in on, particularly in perhaps like the last 3 decades. There's been a lot of attention on the Electoral College. You know, as I was coming here, I was looking at an op-ed called In Defense of the Electoral College, and it was followed by another op-ed that was, it's time we got rid of the Electoral College. And so it really does feel, particularly around elections that are contested, that all of a sudden, conversations around the Electoral College rear their head, and people hone in on it, and the general public hones in on it, as this is the thing that is holding us back. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk, perhaps not a justification for or against,
Sure.
but rooting it in history, you know, what is the purpose of the Electoral College?
I think when you discuss the Electoral College in this particular building, there might be a trapdoor that Ken Hirsch controls, so I'm going to be careful, given the patron. Those are the, sorry, screw. Those are the rules, right? And so what has happened, and I'll defer to the better experts on this, what has happened in this polarization is there has become, and I think it's a coincidence in some, or a happenstance, is that you've had this geographic sorting where the larger states have settled on, the more populous states have in fact settled on tending to prefer one party over the other. And so over the last, I would argue it's been 20 years, 25 years almost, you have an increasing frustration among folks who are center to center left, thinking, why do we live in an undemocratic country? And the answer, as Yuval's writing about, is that it's not really a democratic country, it's a republic. And I think the arguments for and against the Electoral College are fascinating. We can't get anybody to agree on whether they should go to Burger King or Sonic, so I don't think we're going to reform this anytime soon. And so therefore, I think there has to be as much work as we can do. And it's the hardest kind of work because it requires the losers, the seasonal, those who suffer a seasonal defeat, to say that the overall project is worth the cost. And that requires an immense reservoir of character. And it's incredibly difficult. It's the reason democracies are difficult. It's the reason the whole thing is difficult, is because you can have the substance of the law, you can have the letter of the law, but without our assent to it, without agreeing to follow it, I genuinely believe, and look, I'm one of the last 6 Episcopalians in the world, so, but this is a moral crisis. And I use both those terms advisedly. Moral means how we are with one another. It's about mores. It's about seeing each other as neighbors and not as enemies. Crisis comes from Hippocrates. It was initially part of the language of healthcare. It was the moment in a disease where a patient lived or died. And I think that if we don't have an acceptance of the rules and an acceptance of the results, I don't think the system continues to work. And I think it's replaced, I think you're exactly right, with a kind of oligarchical, media-driven system, which you study all the time. I'm sorry to be so gloomy about it, but it does, you know, at the examples I shared with you before, the system survived because people took steps adverse to their own personal interests in that moment. And I know you all are better people than I am, that's not hard. But there's nothing harder than doing that. It's the reason the framers were marvelous students of human nature. because they understood. They were fundamentally Calvinists. You know, it's that we are depraved, as John Witherspoon taught most of them at Princeton. We are subject to our appetites and our ambitions, and therefore you need rules that keep those appetites and ambitions somewhat in check. What we saw 16 months ago was that the rules they didn't break, but they sure as hell bent, didn't they? And I don't know how, and maybe it comes back stronger, but maybe it doesn't.
Yuval, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, you know, I think that, I mean, first of all, the Electoral College is, like so much of our constitutional system, a function of a compromise between a vision of America as a union of states and a vision of America as a unitary nation. And in a lot of ways, it's also an attempt to smooth some of the rough edges of democracy. There are a lot of ways in which the elections that have been very close in the Electoral College were even closer in some respects. It would have been even closer in some respects had they been just popular elections. In a nation as vast as ours, having to recount 300 million votes would be a challenge. Having to recount Georgia is a little bit less of a challenge. And there are ways in which the structure of the Electoral College, both by encouraging candidates to campaign in states where there are competitive contests, rather than just a campaign where population centers are, and by forcing our system to think of itself, to channel its energies through a set of rules that sort of compels our politics to set a few issues up as the key issues in an election, can be helpful. Now, obviously, there are also upsides to a direct election, upsides for legitimacy, upsides for, in an administrative sense. But I think it's crucial to see that the problems that arise around the Electoral College arise at times of intense division in the country. We've had 4 presidential elections in our history where the winner of the Electoral College was not the winner of the popular vote. And all of them occurred in times when the country was basically 50-50. We're living in such a time now, we've been living in such a time for 30 years, and we've gotten used to it. We think it's normal, but it's not normal. American history generally sees 2 parties, one of which is a durable majority for an extended period of time, the other a durable minority, and then there is some event, some dynamic that creates a realignment, and the minority becomes a majority for a while. We've been living since about the early 1990s in a politics in which each side could reasonably expect to win the next election, to win control of Congress, to win the presidency. And that creates a set of incentives, particularly in combination with our primary system, which did not exist the last few times we had 50-50 situations, that encourages the kind of running off to the edges, that encourages both parties to invest in the most intensely committed voters in their coalition, rather than to invest in finding voters who might go either way. And that creates a dynamic of intense polarization. Polarization and parity are not the same thing. We've had polarized times that have not been 50-50 times. There were deep divisions, even hatreds. There was not much in the middle, but you had a majority and a minority. We're now living in a moment where we have both parity and polarization, and that creates incentives for our politicians that are detrimental to public trust, to put it mildly. And we have to think about how to change the incentives, and that means thinking in ways that really get to the structure of our institutions, thinking about experimenting with various kinds of election reform, thinking about institutional reform in the Congress and elsewhere, because the problem we confront now, our politicians have not gone crazy. They're just responding to incentives that, at this point, encourage them to behave as though they've gone crazy. And we have to change those incentives if we're going to change their behavior.
So I want to go back to this longer history of contested elections, perhaps even violent elections, nefarious elections, but not just historically, also in the geopolitical context. And I want to know, is there any good that we can pull out of these examples, whether they be examples that you guys have mentioned here on stage, ones that you were thinking about, other ones that you can think about? Is there any lesson that we can take from these that are useful to our current situation? What's the start us off?
I thought we were going in order, John.
You want happiness
Rachel?
now? Let me say, I of course want to answer the positive question. I do, but something you've all just said. I think we would be remiss in this conversation if we also did not acknowledge, or at least let me offer you all a theory. For all the 1619 versus 1776, for all of that debate, I would argue that the country we're sitting in and the country that has led to this conversation was actually founded in 1965. Mark Updegrove is here. His man did this. The passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was signed in 1965, which undid the restrictionist, nativist quotas that Coolidge had signed in 1924, which were the quotas in place that was what FDR cited when he could not accept more refugees from Nazi Germany. What unfolded in the middle of the 1960s created, think about this, the first genuinely integrated national electorate in American history happened 54 years ago. So this country, you could argue, and I do the same thing, well, we're 250 years old and you get your tricorn hat out and you fife and drum. It's really about a half century old. And so, and I don't think that I'm not arguing that the debates about race in the country are, that the crisis of trust is entirely about it, but it is surely about it. And therefore, it's part of what we have to think about. And one of the things I admire President Bush, both of them, but Bush 43 for, is his insistence that, in fact, this is a nation of immigrants. It's a nation that we are stronger when we open our arms and not when we clench our fists. And I think that the best thing we can do is, as Yuval says, is incentivize the right thing. Because politicians are far more often mirrors of who we are rather than makers. It's the rare politician who's a maker of an era. And that's why we spend time talking about them and writing about them. And I think that's, this is a predictable answer to your question coming from me. When I occasionally talk to politicians, I offer what I call the portrait test. I say, what do you want us to think when we stare at your portrait? It tends to work because most politicians can't imagine a world where we're not staring at their portrait. So they like that. It's like, yeah, well, of course you'll be doing that. And, who do you want to be? You want to be Abraham Lincoln? Or do you want to be a secessionist? Do you want to be someone who built or someone who destroyed? This goes to Lyndon Johnson. The week after Bloody Sunday, he brings George Wallace up to the White House, puts him on that soft couch, and then he looms over him. Says, George, who do you, when they build your grave, do you want it to say George Wallace he hated or George Wallace he built? And so I think you can help incentivize by arguing about how people view you.
I could not agree more. And actually, usually when
No one has ever said that to me, so thank you.
Usually when I talk about American democracy, I say, we're real old and we're real young. We're as a multiracial, fully integrated electorate, we're the same age as most of the new democracies that came out of decolonization. And we need to think about that because that's really how old we are. We have this kind of old plumbing, and we have actually a fairly new...
Are you selling a house or anything?
I hear Texas is a good place to be buying, actually. But old plumbing, but new populace in a lot of ways. And that means we have to work a little extra hard. And I think one of the things we need to work on right now is envisioning what does that mean in the future? Right now, so many of us are just holding on with our fingers to the edge of the ledge. Don't give away what I have. It's a funny viewpoint because actually America is one of the richest countries in the history of the world. We're some of the healthiest people. As a populace, we're doing well, and not perfectly. The opioid crisis and so on is hitting hard. I don't want to make light of that. But we're better than we've been doing for a lot of our history. And so this sense of fear and scarcity and I got to get mine, that, as Jon is saying, is a moral issue. And I think it's up to us and our many leaders, not just our political leaders, but our congregational leaders, our business leaders, and so on, to start reminding us that there is a future America, a next chapter of America that looks at this multiracial electorate, this Republican system, and says, what do we want to be as a country next? Where's our place in it, builder or hater? And then what do we want to envision for this next chapter?
I want to really build on just that thing, because I think if you step back from our politics right now and ask yourself, what are we talking about? The answer is not the future. We're not talking about the future. We're asking the question that a society that has lost trust asks, which is, can we make it? Can we survive? But the United States has got a lot going for it, and what it needs is a politics that is building for a stronger future. That kind of politics would be less contentious, because it would really be about what could we have that we don't have, not about fighting to the death over what we do have, but about how can we turn this into something more. That's a politics that offers more questions, that offers more options for coalitions, that's not stuck at 50-50. Each party is not just persuading the country that the other party is the biggest problem it has. Neither party is our country's biggest problem. Our country's biggest problem is this loss of trust and this loss of sight of the future. And if we could see the future, then we could see past the other party and could really also find ways to work with the other party.
Okay.
To answer your question, that I prevented us from doing, and so I take the blame.
You kind of answered it.
The example, I would argue, is 1933 forward. That 100 years ago, this felt a little bit like this, right? You had the 1920 census was the first time more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The immigration quota, as I mentioned, this founding of the second Klan, which was in 1915, there were 5 United States senators, something like 20 members of the House, and 5 governors were members of the Klan 100 years ago, including the governor of Texas. Also Indiana, Colorado, Oregon, and Georgia. And so, and in my native state, we had a trial about a theory that parents didn't want taught in the schools because they thought it was disturbing. It was called evolution. So radio comes in 1921, widely commercially available, and by 1924, so you had this was unfolding. The history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, as Twain said. So what happened? The Depression happens, the crash happens, and what Roosevelt proved was that because democracies could produce the conditions for prosperity and could provide some measure of security, which is the theme that Eisenhower picked up 20 years later and said famously, you know, no party that wants to take away Social Security will be that would be political suicide. By proving that the state could in fact help shape the marketplace, it proved that in an era where dictatorship was on the march, democracies could deliver. And so I would argue that the closest we've come to losing, there's Sumter, there's 2020, 21, but probably third is 32, 33.
So I think we have time maybe for one more rapid fire question. And this one is the big, visionary thinking one. And that is, what are institutions either doing or what can they do, I think, to help instill trust and faith in our electoral process, in elections, in election integrity? We know that it's so important, particularly since it's a cornerstone of democracy. So what's happening out there that we can talk about, or what could these various industries and institutions be doing?
First of all, I think looking at just what's happened is, I want to go to Yuval's point here about what can happen. I think it's worth looking at FDR as one moment of change. The progressive era is another. People think of the progressive era. We were last this polarized in the Gilded Age, and we're facing similar levels of violence and so on. And what the progressive era did, which people think now is a left-wing movement, but actually Theodore Roosevelt ran on the progressive ticket. It was a movement of both parties for change. And one of the changes they brought in was ranked choice voting, later got pulled back. But one of the ways that ranked choice voting helps, and it just got passed in my native Alaskan state, is that it allows people from the same party to run against each other without being spoilers. And one of the positives about that is that you can pick your flavor. You know, you're a very left-wing Democrat or you're a pro-business Democrat. You're a conservative Republican on social issues, you're a business Republican. You can pick against pick your party, but pick from a number of folks. It's a very important sort of way to pull back from the kind of extremism, and it's happening in certain places. Other things that are really important are localism. That's another reason I go back to the progressive movement. You know, if you were for playgrounds, you were progressive. We didn't have them that much, but also if you were for prison reform, they covered the gamut. Some of their ideas were good, some were really awful. So I'm not talking about the ideas themselves, but the methodology of localizing, you could act. I think now a lot of people feel a sense of lack of agency. I mean, I used to work on my truck. I had a great GMC pickup truck when I was younger. I loved that truck, and I could work on it. Now, I can't change a spark plug in my car. I have no idea what the electronics do. That's how we feel about all aspects of our lives right now. Agency is important, and local action is important. We still have trust in the local level, and there's a lot of things that we need to be doing at the local level. And so innovative cities, innovative mayors are trying to do things like democracy in one room, deliberation, participatory ways of distributing their budgets. Lots of ways to give people more agency and more understanding of what's going on under the hood of our democracy. And I think we need to build on this.
I would just stress what Rachel says. I think if you want to be hopeful about America, you've got to look at it from the bottom up. And that's not just how things could work, but also how they do work. In a lot of places where you have to solve problems, people just solve problems. It can get to even at the state level, if you think about it. I live in the state of Maryland, which isn't far from Washington, and yet feels pretty far from Washington in its politics. We have a Republican governor, a Democratic legislature. It doesn't really occur to them that they could just stand on opposite sides and talk about each other. They have to do their jobs every day. And in a lot of cities, politics works that way. In a lot of American civil society, there's a problem here. And the problem is not the other people. The problem has to be dealt with by some form of common action. And I think ultimately, our national politics is going to have to learn from the local level and in some respects the state level that in order to overcome division and difference, you have to focus on concrete, practical work. And at this point, too much of our national politics is basically symbolic debate about cultural issues. And it's very hard to overcome differences when the difference is the subject and all you can talk about is the other party.
I'm all in favor of this sense of neighborliness. I will say, someone tweeted some months ago that if Doris Goodwin and Mr. Rogers had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. Doris was very upset. She was like, well, couldn't we have fallen in love? I said, no, he picked you up in the bar at C-SPAN. That's what he did. But I think it's religious. I think it's about citizenship. I think it's about customers. If you want to keep customers, you want to keep a democracy. Do you want to have to pay off various oligarchs to sell your products? I don't. You know, if you don't have democratic capitalism, what are the alternatives? Kleptocracy, oligarchies. You know, so I also think it's a huge issue for the faith community. You know, and look, Jesus was preaching into a complicated climate. You don't issue commandments if people are already doing it, right? If everybody had been loving their neighbor, he wouldn't have thought to say love your neighbor, right? So I think we can learn from that.
All right, so there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and I want to thank our panelists for their words of wisdom, for their brilliance, and for their expertise. Thank you all.